It's time for another edition of Lewis at Large, 60 minutes of smart talk radio featuring guests from all walks of life in conversation with your host, Warner Lewis. So sit back and lend us your ears for the next hour. Now here with today's first guest is the host of Lewis at Large, Warner Lewis.
Well, welcome everybody to another segment of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck. And of course, as always, Smart Talk Radio is in your future. Extremely pleased to have with us Melvin Goodman. He is a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy. He's also a professor of government at Johns Hopkins University, former CIA analyst. He's the author of Failure of Intelligence, The Decline and Fall of the CIA, and National Insecurity, The Cost of American Militarism. Extremely interesting conversation coming up for sure. Also a brand new work called A Whistleblower at the CIA. Mel, how are you, my friend?
I'm fine, Warner. Good to be with you this morning.
Well, we're pleased to have you here. Let's do this. Let's do a little bit better setup for our Lewis at Large listeners across Northeast Kansas. Tell us a little bit about how you got into intelligence work. Why was that attractive to you? Give us a little bit about your career path.
Well, I think the two major items in my career that led me to the CIA, one was I was in the Army from 1955 to 1958 as a cryptographer. So I was coding messages, decoding messages, and I was fascinated by what was in the general press as opposed to what was in State Department cables and military reports, that there were larger stories out there. So when I went to school, and particularly graduate school at Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana, I was majoring in Russian studies this entire time, and all of my degrees, my graduate degrees, my PhD, was in Russian studies. So it was natural for me to look for either a teaching position or a government position. I considered the Foreign Service and looked into the CIA, and it was the CIA that was genuinely interested in my academic background. The State Department didn't seem as interested as the CIA was in my academic background. And given my interest in intelligence, I joined the CIA in 1966 as an intelligence analyst. And for 15 years, until I reached a turning point, this was a very successful period for me. I enjoyed the work thoroughly. It was challenging. I thought it was important. I thought I was making a contribution. And I had a great 15-year experience.
Mel, has the role of the CIA and its mission, has it changed substantially over the last decade or so?
Well, I think over the last decade, the big change has been in finding that the CIA is more of a paramilitary organization than it is an intelligence organization. And what I mean by that, with the expansion of the war on terror, the global war on terror, the CIA has gotten into heavy military activity, their own drone program, for example, the fact that they're involved in wars, in some cases undeclared wars. And I think the intelligence they collect now has been focused on these policy interests in the military battles, and therefore the intelligence collection has not been effective on strategic political matters. So I think what the CIA has become is a paramilitary organization. And remember, when Harry Truman set up the CIA in 1947, because it was his National Security Act that established the CIA, he wanted an intelligence organization in terms of collection and analysis, the two areas I was interested in. And in a note he wrote, he made it clear he did not want a cloak and dagger organization. Well, with Presidents Eisenhower and Kennedy, what he got was a cloak and dagger organization, and now under the last, three presidents really, Bush, Obama, and now Trump, you have the CIA as a paramilitary organization.
So tell us a little bit, if you would. Again, you were a former CIA analyst, and your latest book, A Whistleblower in the CIA. Where are things going south there? And maybe I'm implying too much there. Tell us a little bit about the premise of a whistleblower at the CIA.
No, you're not implying too much at all. You're spot on. I reached a turning point in 1981. So from 1966 to 1981, I was an intelligence analyst on Soviet foreign policy. I thought we did some very good work during this period. There were some intelligence failures. There's always intelligence failures, but there are also intelligence successes. But we were allowed to do our job. In 1981, the country elected a very conservative president, Ronald Reagan, and he put in an ideologue as the CIA director, and that was, of course, William Casey. And Casey's role at the CIA was to change the intelligence message on the Soviet Union to suit the President of the United States, Ronald Reagan. And what Reagan wanted to do was increase defense spending in an unprecedented way for peacetime. There was no need to increase defense spending in 1981. Remember, this was the decade when the Soviet Union was beginning to show signs of real wear and tear, and in 1991, of course, they fell apart completely. But Reagan wanted his defense budget, and to have a defense budget get through the Congress, you have to show there's a threat. So Casey's job at the CIA, along with the deputy he brought in, Robert Gates, was to exaggerate the intelligence on the Soviet Union, and I simply would not play that game. So I fought it for 5 years, from 1981 to 1986, did not have a great deal of success. So in 1986, I went to the National War College, and I was on the faculty there for 18 years as a professor of international security. And in 1991, when President George H.W. Bush, Bush Sr., appointed Robert Gates as director of the CIA, I decided to go public with my opposition to the Gates appointment. And in 1991, I testified at the Senate Intelligence Committee hearings on the confirmation for Robert Gates. So the issue was, the turning point was, and why I became a dissident and a whistleblower, was the appointment of Robert Gates, who was responsible for politicizing intelligence, that is, falsifying intelligence. And I felt this needed to be taken to a political body like the Senate Intelligence Committee, but it also should be understood by the nation at large. When you have a secret intelligence organization operating in a democracy, it's important for the people to understand as much as possible. I'm not talking about giving away sensitive information. There is sensitive information that needs to be protected, but there's a lot of information that's just classified in order to prevent embarrassment, and I'm opposed to protecting those kinds of secrets that are just designed to prevent embarrassment.
Is the CIA now a more political organization than in years past?
It's far more political, and even the appointment of this CIA director by Donald Trump, and that's, of course, Michael Pompeo, from your state, actually. Very conservative ideologue from Kansas, a member of the Tea Party, someone who believes that torture and abuse are a good thing and would like to restore waterboarding, someone who's opposed to the Iranian nuclear agreement, which I think is a real benefit for U.S. foreign policy. I worry about someone like Pompeo with his West Point background coming in to politicize intelligence. I don't think this was a very good appointment. To put someone as ideological and as conservative as Pompeo in as director of CIA, where you need to be extremely open-minded. You have to look at all sides of an issue. You're not there to defend the policy. You're there to give the president advice on what is happening in a particular country. What are the positives and what are the negatives? And in other words, paint a picture to show where policy might work, but also where it might not work. In fact, when you go back to CIA analysis on Vietnam, the CIA made it clear that the policy in Vietnam was not going to succeed. It was presidents who ignored this intelligence, but the CIA actually did its job. Well, now you fast forward to Bush Jr., George W. Bush, in 2002, 2003, who wanted intelligence to support his war in Iraq, which is probably the biggest mistake any president ever made. So instead of telling the president the truth, giving him the intelligence with the bark on so he knew what the problems would be, the president got the intelligence he wanted. So he got bad intelligence to support a very stupid war, and we're still paying for those decisions to this day.
If you just joined us, yours truly, Warner Lewis, from the flight deck of Lewis at Large Radio. We're talking to Melvin Goodman. He's a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy and a professor of government at Johns Hopkins University. He's a former CIA analyst. He's also the author of Failure of Intelligence, The Decline and Fall of the CIA. And a newer work, his latest book, is called A Whistleblower. at the CIA. Mel, I'm a little bit of a left turn here, but I want to explore it while I've got you on the show here, and that is, what was the role, and analyze, if you would, the CIA's position, its knowledge, and what it could or could not have done regarding 9/11.
9/11, to me, was an intelligence failure. I don't think it was a politicized failure. In other words, they weren't following the dictates of a policy mentor. I just don't think they used a lot of imagination in analyzing the intelligence they had. And just background for this, intelligence collection at the CIA and in all the intelligence agencies of the government, there are about 16 or 17, and a lot of them collect intelligence. The intelligence collection is outstanding. When we've had failures, and I'm talking about U.S. failures that go back to before the CIA, it wasn't due to the collection. It was due to the analysis. So I would start, for example, with Pearl Harbor. We had broken the Japanese military code. We knew that they were going to attack. We didn't know where and when specifically, but the warning should have gone out to the appropriate military officers who were in places such as Hawaii and the Philippines. Well, I would argue that for 9/11, we knew that Al-Qaeda was planning something big, and not just to aim at the United States overseas, but to aim at the United States itself. And I think the analysis wasn't rigorous enough. It wasn't as innovative as it could have been, and it wasn't imaginative as it should have been in terms of what was bin Laden really planning against the United States. We knew that he had a program to hijack American aircraft. We knew that there had been an example of this in France in the early 1990s, that French intelligence broke up. We knew that they had agents they had sent into California, into the San Diego area. There was an FBI agent by the name of Colleen Rowley who had identified someone who had knowledge of Al-Qaeda, who was located in Minneapolis. This was Moussaoui, and the FBI wouldn't let her go ahead and tap his phone and get into his computer. There was no real belief that Al-Qaeda would really attack the United States in the United States. So if your assumptions are wrong, and your assumptions drive your collection of intelligence and analysis of intelligence, you're ultimately going to be wrong. And I think the 9/11 report was an extent, a partial cover-up of how poor the CIA did in this area. There was an Inspector General's report at the CIA that made it clear who was responsible for a lot of the failure, but this report basically was covered up to a large extent. So 9/11 did not have to happen. And when you think of an event that changed American domestic and foreign policies as dramatically as 9/11 did, you can see how much harm is done with an intelligence failure. And this is long-lasting harm, because from 9/11, you get right to the phony war with Iraq in 2003. And with the phony war in Iraq, you look at the Americans who have died unnecessarily in places such as Iraq and Afghanistan, our deployments now in places such as Syria, the drone battles we wage in places like Pakistan and the Horn of Africa. It's really been the tail that's wagged the American national security policy, and it's all of it in terms of United States interests, I would say, is completely problematic. I don't know what interests are being served by our increased involvement in places such as Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan. We're overexposed in the Middle East, and I think it's hurting United States interest over the long run in terms of where we should be concentrating in terms of improving relations with China, and I would say even improving relations with Russia.
What about, let's fast forward to modern day. What, I know you don't work there, but if you were working there, what would the CIA be doing right now with information about North Korea?
Well, the problem for North Korea in terms of the intelligence is really getting an embassy in Pyongyang. You know, if you don't have an embassy in a capital, you don't have really a place to house intelligence agencies, intelligence analysts, intelligence officers. And when you think about it, the two countries we seem to be concerned with the most these days in terms of what we read in the daily press are Iran, where we have a nuclear agreement, and North Korea, where we would like to have a nuclear agreement. Well, we don't recognize these two countries. Diplomatically, we have no dealings. So if you have no dealings, you have no embassy. If you have no embassy, you have no intelligence collection on the ground in terms of seeking genuine ground truth. So to me, the first challenge is a diplomatic one of creating an embassy, creating diplomatic relations. And then the second challenge is looking at the North Korean program as a diplomatic problem. And here I think intelligence analysts can help, because there are a lot of things that North Korea would like from the United States that would give us leverage. They would like to have recognition. They would like to have an embassy. They would like a peace treaty from the Korean War from the 1950s. There was an armistice. There was never a peace treaty. They would like to have some guarantee that we would cut back on these aggressive exercises that we hold with South Korea that are very threatening to the North. They would like to have an understanding that we're not going to put nuclear weapons back in South Korea. They would like an understanding that we're not going to expand the so-called high-altitude missile defense. Now, in return for these kinds of developments, I think North Korea may have something to say about its nuclear program. This is what President Clinton did in 1993 and 1994, where he actually got a freeze on their nuclear program that lasted nearly 10 years until George W. Bush came along in 2001 and made it clear he wasn't interested in this agreed framework, which did provide a freeze on their nuclear program. So we always talk about North Korea in a military context, which is extremely dangerous, because if you're in South Korea looking across the border, the capital Seoul is within artillery range, let alone missile range, of North Korea. So we're playing a very serious game with North Korea and putting millions of lives at risk in South Korea, and particularly in the capital, when we're not really looking at what are the diplomatic aspects to this problem. And now what Trump has done to worsen this situation, he's surrounded himself basically with general officers who have never been interested in arms control, never interested in disarmament, never really concerned about diplomacy. So you have a general as a Secretary of Defense, a general as the Chief of Staff, a general as the National Security Advisor, and you have a Secretary of State in Rex Tillerson with really no background in international relations who has no staff. If you look at the 24 key positions at the State Department in terms of deputy secretaries, undersecretaries, assistant secretaries, of the 24, 2 have been filled. So you have people without any institutional memory, and in North Korea you need a great deal of institutional memory, giving advice to a president who seems to operate by the seat of his pants. So the intelligence challenge really is, how do you inform this president? How do you keep this president up to date on intelligence matters when it's difficult to collect intelligence in the first place and very difficult to reach the president because he's surrounded by general officers who don't have a great deal of interest in diplomacy?
Again, you're listening to Lewis at Large. Our guest this segment is former CIA analyst Melvin Goodman. He's also a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy and a professor of government at Johns Hopkins University. Mel, I wanted to ask you about a quote, a recent piece you did for Counterpunch. You said one of the reasons why the United States has so little credibility in making the case against Russian interference in U.S. presidential elections is the sordid record of the White House and the CIA in conducting regime change and even political assassination to influence political conditions around the world. That is a mouthful. Can you tell us what you mean by that? Explain that a little bit, if you would.
Well, you know, Donald Trump in an interview, I think before he was inaugurated, but after he was elected, was sort of reminding the interviewer, you know, that we've done some nasty things around the world, too. And this happened to be, he made this statement, I don't know if a lot of people knew this, he made this statement after he was being briefed by the CIA on covert operations. One of the first briefings a new president gets is from the military on all of our military programs and our sensitive military programs and our sensitive military exercises, as well as a briefing from the CIA on covert action, what we're doing around the world to advance American interests. Well, when you look at what the CIA has done in terms of what we think is advancing American interests, look what we did in Iran, where we helped to overthrow a democratically elected president in 1953. Look what we did in Vietnam when we helped to neutralize the Diem government in South Vietnam in 1963, leaving us without any legitimate government to work with, which was one of the problems in fighting a war in Vietnam. Look what we did in Chile in 1971 and 1973 after a socialist was elected. Look at the attempt to assassinate Lumumba, the leftist leader in the Congo, which opened the doors to the worst tyrant in the history of Africa in terms of Mobutu, who emerged to take the top spot in the Congo. So what I'm saying is if you look at all of these exercises of regime change and political assassination, all worked against the interests of the United States over the long run. Every one was a strategic failure and a strategic nightmare. And the one thing we don't know now about cyber activity is, okay, the Russians did hack into the Democratic National Committee. I believe that. What are we doing? And can't we call a halt to this activity by using diplomacy with Russia? If you look at Russian-American relations along the broad front, we have agreements to avoid incidents at sea. We have agreements to prevent accidental measures. We have agreements to prevent third world countries from leading the United States and Russia into a military confrontation. Why can't you have an agreement on cyber activity? What is legitimate and what is illegitimate? Remember, you had a very dangerous U.S. activity using cyber techniques, which I think was an act of cyber war, that we did in collusion with Israel, and that was the Stuxnet virus that we introduced into Iran to try to stop their centrifuge program and slow down their nuclear activity. This was a very dangerous precedent. What if another country sort of violated American industrial power in this fashion in an area that included military-industrial relations? I think we would perceive that as an act of war. So what I was talking about, if we're going to talk about Russian hacking, let's have an understanding of what is involved in this. I'd like to know more about what the United States is doing, and then it would beg the question of why can't Moscow and Washington sit down and discuss this problem? That's what we did with China. China broke into the OPM, the Office of Personnel and Management, and stole the names of hundreds of thousands of American government workers, including workers from the CIA who probably were supposed to be protected in terms of their cover status with the Central Intelligence Agency. So we didn't sign a written agreement with China, but we sat down with them and verbally worked out an understanding of what's allowed and what's off limits in terms of cyber activity and potential cyber warfare. The problem with this technology is it's out of control. We need to get more engaged on a diplomatic front of what's permissible and what isn't permissible.
Mel, as we start to kind of wind down here, as a former CIA analyst yourself, and again, I recognize you don't work there now, but from where you sit and what you know, without being too much, we're not trying to do being alarmist here, but what do you see? Is there an entity, a country, a government, an organization out there, in your opinion, that poses the greatest threat to our national security? And is there an entity out there or organization or country that you believe is we're sort of overblowing it or we're overly alarmed with it?
I think most of what we're reading in the press is alarmist. The most important independent variable on the international front in terms of international change, international violence, and even international confrontation is actually the United States. Remember, it's only the United States that has military power all over the world. It's only the United States that has hundreds of military facilities all over the world. It's only the United States that's fighting these military engagements around the world, some declared and some undeclared. Let's face it, we've used the authorization to use force in the wake of 9/11, legitimately in the case of Afghanistan, but illegitimately in places in Africa and places in the Middle East as well. When you look at other powers, frankly, I think Russia is being incredibly exaggerated in terms of their power. I think Putin is looking for a dialogue with the United States, and he probably hoped Trump would provide that opening, but because of the domestic consequences of Russian hacking and this mystery about what is Trump's real relationship with Russia, I think his hands are tied right now. China doesn't have the military power that we have, and we've exaggerated their role in the South China Sea. What China is doing in the South China Sea is what any regional power would do. It's what we do in the Caribbean. It's what ancient Athens and Rome did in the Mediterranean. I'm not saying we should give up on access to the sea and our legitimate navigation rights, but we don't have to make a military confrontation out of this. And again, to go back to North Korea, that should be a diplomatic challenge, and the challenge with China should be make them a stakeholder. China agrees with us. They don't want to have nuclear weapons in the hands of the North Koreans. The Russians feel the same way, and we work with all of these powers to get an agreement with Iran. Why can't we do that with North Korea? We should at least try it. China, for the past year, has presented a proposal to us in which we would stop for a short period of time military exercise with South Korea, and in exchange, North Korea would stop its nuclear testing. I would take up that offer, see what it leads to. I don't see what the risk is in a situation such as that. So maybe the greatest challenge right now on an international front is the challenge of the United States and how the United States uses its power, and particularly this over-reliance on military power. Let's face it, these wars we fought have not been successful. They've been fool's errands. When you look at Vietnam, when you look at Iraq, when you look at Afghanistan, we have suffered serious defeats in these areas because it's not the kind of military challenge that our military power can really deal with. And that's why we have sort of conducted ourselves in such a mediocre fashion in places such as Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. So I think it's time to start questioning military power. And President Eisenhower, again from your state of Kansas, certainly had it right in terms of warnings about the military-industrial complex. We overly rely on military power, and it's not working.
Well, unfortunately, we're running out of time here. We've been speaking to Melvin Goodman, again, a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy and a professor of government at Johns Hopkins University. He's also a former CIA analyst, and the latest work is called A Whistleblower at the CIA. Mel, how can people get a copy of the book and also find out a little bit more about some of the previous writings and work that you do?
Well, the book is available from Amazon.com, of course. The writings are on counterpunch.org. All my op-eds are archived there. And I have a website, melvingoodman.com, which also gives you access to all of my writings, my work with the Center for International Policy in Washington, D.C., as well as a way to purchase not only Whistleblower at the CIA, but also National Insecurity and the Failure of Intelligence and the other books I've done.
Well, appreciate your time and your insights and your observations, and boy, we would love to have you back on again and continue the conversation. There's certainly a lot to talk about.
I would love to do that, and I found this a great, fast-moving interview. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
You bet. We'll be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.